These videos are recorded to talk you through how to answer questions in English Language Paper 2 for the AQA Examination Board. When it comes to the sources that I've used and the examples that I've written on today, they are from the November 2022 paper. So when it comes to that, you're going to need to ask your teacher for a copy of those sources so that you can actually answer them, and you can get either the questions from here or from them as well. The knowledge organizer that I use for this, I'm going to copy and paste into the description of the videos, so you can find all of my tips and all the bullet points in there as to the targets that you need to be using to answer those questions. Question 4 for English Language Paper 2 is a really quite tricky question, and it deals a lot with perspective and tone. That's the skills that you're going to be focusing when it comes to this question. It's out of 16 marks, which means that it's longer than the other questions, so you need to spend a little bit longer on this one, but obviously you've also got to give yourself a fair amount of time when it comes to the transactional writing later on in the paper. So when it comes to my introduction, what I've said is you're going to need to be able to identify the perspective of the writers and the tones they create. So it might be that it's a really sarcastic piece of writing, it could be that it's humorous, it could be that it's really serious and informative, but you need to figure this out when it comes to writing about it. You're able to use the whole of both sources for this question, which gives you a massive amount of text to actually get your quotations from, so hopefully you remember some decent moments that you can actually talk about when it comes to this question. You also need language analysis when it comes to this one, just like in question 3, but you also need to actually convey at the same time perspective and tone when talking about the language in your answer. Questions out of 16 marks, fine. Tips: make sure you answer on the perspective of the writers. I've read fantastic answers, but they don't talk about the perspective of the writer, and I can give them very little credit because of this. Anything else, as I say, is not relevant. Absolutely not. So make sure you've got the perspective of the writers and hopefully the tone that they create in their writing too. The perspective of the writers can change within the extracts, and oftentimes actually at the end of the sources you'll find some kind of reversal where the tone or the perspective changes by the end of the text. And so maybe it's a good thing to actually include both tones when it comes to talking about them. My list of targets for this one, it looks enormous, it really isn't. It's pretty much the same as the previous one, apart from one added thing. So, to start off with, point or topic sentence. Pretty much the same as every other question, questions 2, 3, and this case 4 as well. A well-chosen quotation, exactly the same. So how you start paragraphs naturally. Third part then is intelligent explanation of the quotation. So pick on the words, pick on the language, and you can see that in my fourth one as well. Pick on specific words and techniques and elaborate on their connotations and effects, because it does ask you for language analysis as well, and we'll have a look at the question to show you that and where it needs to, where it shows you need to do that. My next target is link back to the perspective of the writer and the tone created in their writing. That's essentially the same as linking back to the question, because in this case the perspective is going to be the question. Afterwards then, a connective which links to a point or a topic sentence for the next source is essentially a repetition of this purple one up here, apart from you just need a connective at the start of it. So connective followed by a point for the next source. Then again, quotation, intelligent explanation, pick on words and techniques, and then link back. So pretty much the same as what we've got going on here. The final one though is slightly different. Compare specifically between the two sources. If you don't do that, then it's actually just a bit of language analysis on the perspectives, but they might as well be two different sources or two different questions. So compare specifically, and you can't do that with just a connective. It needs to be more than just a connective. My example then is from November 22, and you can see what it's expecting you to do in the various bullet points here. So for this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A and the whole of source B, compare how the writers convey their different feelings and perspectives of their experiences of sleep and sleeplessness. So in this case you can see feelings and perspectives. That's what you need to focus on, of sleep and sleeplessness. Anything else is completely irrelevant, and you'll have the equivalent of any paper. It'll give you something very specific to focus on, and it will be the perspective of the authors. When it comes to your bullet points then, to give you a little bit of a tip as to what you've got to answer in the exam, you could compare their different feelings and perspectives on the experiences of sleep and sleeplessness. You get that then with, yeah, you connective a tiny amount, but actually at the end in your conclusions, compare specifically between the two sources. This bullet point, compare the methods they use to convey their feelings and perspectives, is this red colour here, specific words and techniques, and elaborate on their connotations and their effects. and then support your response with references to both texts is use quotations. Okay, so that's what you need to do when it comes to this one, and let's have a look at an example answer. It's quite a long one because in this case I've combined all of those targets into one great big piece of writing. So let's see how well I do. The first thing that I'm going to need is a point or a topic sentence that explores the perspective of one of the authors. In this case I'm starting with source B, and let's have a look. What did I put? Fern in source B expresses frustration to the point of exaggeration when talking about sleep deprivation. So we're not getting any sleep. So there's the perspective, frustration, okay, and a point to the point of exaggeration. So she does it quite dramatically when she's talking about how being sleep deprived is awful. So in this case I'm going to highlight it in purple because that is my point. The next thing then that I'm going to need is a quotation to actually back that up. In this case I've got, she writes, "Open the windows and sneer at the black demons as they buzz in for their nocturnal raid." It's a pretty decent quotation. There's plenty to actually analyse in that one, so I'm happy with the choice there, and I can talk about it quite confidently. Here, Fern is taking her anger out on the mosquitoes for disturbing her sleep. So I've got some analysis, intelligent explanation of that quotation. It's not specific words or techniques yet, but we're going to get there. So she's really angry at those mosquitoes for disturbing her sleep. She goes on. She exaggerates when calling them black demons to make them appear more monstrous and hateful, giving her writing a tone of frustration and perhaps even desperation whilst longing for a night's sleep. So I kind of do a couple of things in there, but I'm going to colour it in this colour, this kind of reddish colour. Exaggerates when calling them black demons to make them appear more monstrous. The other thing that I do though that is pretty decent in this line is giving her writing a tone of frustration. That is linking back to the question and her perspective, because I've said at the start, expresses frustration, and a tone of frustration, that's her perspective, she's really frustrated. Okay, moving on. You've got, however, the imagery of someone in the middle of the night opening their windows and sneering at nearly invisible mosquitoes could also come across as quite comic. Because it's quite funny. The idea of somebody actually getting up in the middle of the night and just giving mosquitoes a ridiculous luck also gives you this kind of comic tone to the writing. So it's frustration, but also to the point of exaggeration, which is pretty decent as well. So I'm going to go back to this colour for analysis. It's decent analysis of the quotation, and it works really quite nicely. It also links back to this tone, this perspective, because it's actually quite comic in terms of her writing, because she's obviously writing after the event. While she demonises the mosquitoes, she might be doing this for comedic effect to appeal to the reader of the magazine she writes for. So I would suggest then this one is this pink target up here, link back to the perspective, demonises the mosquitoes, but she might be doing it for comic effect. That's her tone, that's her perspective as well. So she hates them, she hates the mosquitoes disturbing her sleep, but she's also looking back at it as something that's quite humorous that she can write about for whatever magazine that she's writing for. So linking back to the question, really quite nice. We then move on then to source A. So I've started with source B, source A now. Source A, by comparison, is more serious in how they write about their insomnia. So this is the tone, it's more serious, okay? So by comparison, there is my connective. So you can see this one here, connective, and then at the same time, my next point. So I'm going to go back to the purple colour because that is certainly a point. The expectation then is that I'm going to have some evidence afterwards. So Akbar writes, sore eyes, itchy skin, and a high-pitched sense of mental hysteria. Using a list, okay, I'll forget the using the list for now. Akbar writes, here's my quotation. After my quotation, I've got using a list to document the many symptoms they have experienced as a result of limited sleep. So there's my analysis. Here's a list, lots and lots of symptoms. And so those symptoms are sore eyes, itchy skin, high-pitched sense of mental hysteria. Afterwards then I go into Akbar here is more factual and informative to suggest the serious harm lack of sleep can cause. So fantastic. more analysis. It's factual because in this case it's really quite serious. And then we're going to go into my other final target, the one that we haven't done so far. While source A seems to want to inform and potentially help readers suffering the same condition, source B is written more for entertainment using an anecdotal tone to vent her frustration at her interrupted night's sleep. So that is very specific comparison. Source A does this and source B does this. That means then that I'm nicely comparative when I'm talking about their tones, and I've certainly answered the question because I'm not just talking about two sources separately, I'm actually comparing the two of them together. So hopefully you're going to get something similar to that when it comes to writing your own. You might say around about this one, when I'm talking about a list, it might be picking on specific techniques, and so that could be in red as well. There's plenty of terminology, language terminology when it comes to my answer as well, so if you can actually include that, then it'll definitely make it sound a little bit more sophisticated. But otherwise it's a very good answer, and hopefully something that you can replicate when it comes to your own answers. I'll just put that on the screen there.